Hey guys, this is Public bringing you the 735 Shadow Priest Dungeon Guide. I know it's been a while. I meant to make this a lot sooner. It's just a lot of things just kind of caught up with me and it just didn't happen. But the good news is the guide is here today, so we'll go over everything you know to play your Shadow Priest in a Mythic Plus dungeon environment. Two little caveats before we get started. This guide is aimed at kind of the average range, I'd say, of a Mythic Plus dungeon player. So this means like pretty much between key levels of 10 to 20. Outside of those ranges, those are kind of the extremes right now for playing your character in a dungeon environment. And there are some things that will change slightly in both of the extreme cases. So very low keys below 10 or very high keys above 20. So generally speaking, things aren't going to change too crazy if you're below or above that range. But I feel like if you're above that range, you probably already know that. So we'll kind of get started here. With that being said, I will cover lots of things in this guide. So we're going to start out going over talents. So what talents you should think about picking based on your group, things like that. We'll also quickly go over gearing, so mainly just trinkets and legendaries and that kind of thing. We'll spend some time on your rotation, how do you actually damage things in different mob packs. And then we'll do quick tips on actual affixes, on things like that. And then towards the end, I will talk a little bit about how to start pushing keys. If you're only hitting 15s, you want to go a little higher. If you want to say push into 20s and higher, I'll go over that in a little bit of detail, as well as kind of things you can use in your toolkit to help you survive. And we'll kind of go over all those things in this guide. All right, without further ado, let's get started. All right, guys, so the first thing we're going to cover in this guide is talents. Now, these are pretty much your big choices that you have with your Shadow Priest. So, unfortunately, there is not something I can say like, insert this affix and these are the talents you pick. Or, insert this group comp, this is the affix, or these are the talents you pick, right? There are so many different combinations of things, and it all comes down to what does your group need? Or what can you do most to help benefit the group? These are the questions you're trying to answer with your talent setups. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of choices here, but we do have a few important ones that you can make. So, first things first, level 15 row, you're always going to take Twist of Fate. Don't even look at Fortress of the Mind or Shadowward Void, not even a little bit at all. Level 30 row, this is slightly preference. However, I will say Body and Soul is generally speaking your go-to here. It gives you your on-demand movement that you really, really want when you're transitioning in between packs. I don't think Mania really has a big use. Again, kind of a preference choice here, but you do you on those two. Now, I will mention real quick, Masochism is a thing. I know many people don't even read the tooltip or understand what it does, but and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you can use Masochism if you're looking to push up into higher keys and you need more damage reduction. If you didn't know, casting Shadow Word Mend with Masochism talented, you take 10% less damage. So it's a very small percentage of damage, but it can help you in those situations where you really, really, really need a 10% DR. So there's that. Now, level 45 row, again, not too much choice here. I don't think I've ever seen anyone take Dominant Mind or Psychic Voice. It just doesn't make any sense. Mind Bomb is too good, too strong in Mythic Plus, mainly for, one, having an AoE stun every 30 seconds is one of the best in the game, and then two, you basically get a free ability to proc Cephas on cooldown. So, and we'll talk more about when you should use it and when you shouldn't in a bit, but again, Mind Bomb default here. Level 60 row, same thing, Lingering Insanity. You're going to take this all the time. Reaper of Souls is just completely nixed out. Void Ray, you would think might have some value here in certain situations, but unless you're never chain pulling, like really hard never chain pulling, and what I mean by that is you're not pulling one pack and then going right to the next one, then you can maybe not take Lingering Insanity, but no one will pull the dungeon like that. In order for that to be effective, you'd need like 30 or 40 seconds of downtime between every pack, which just doesn't happen. So again, Lingering Insanity straight up default here, no change there. And level 75 row, more of the same thing. You're going to take Auspicious Spirits all the time, no consideration there really. You could argue taking Sand Land. We used to take it sometimes, but again, it's just not really a thing. I don't really see anyone taking it at all, so just stick with AS here. Now, level 90 row, this is where our first kind of choice comes in. Power Infusion is pretty much not taken in any scenario right now, at least from my perspective. The two options we have is Misery and Mindbender. So This decision is not as clear cut as it used to be. We had the recent changes with, I believe, the 7.3.2 patch, or maybe it was 7.3.5, can't remember, that buffed our Void Eruption and changed the actual mechanic of Void Eruption. So before, in order to get the full damage output of Void Eruption, you needed to have both dots on every target you wanted the damage on. For that reason, Misery was pretty nice because you could save a global on every target and then still get your massive Void Eruption damage. Well, now Void Eruption only requires one dot on each target. So you can just Shadow Word Pain everything or VT everything and then cast Void Eruption, still get the full benefit of that damage. And Void Eruption is still a pretty significant part of your damage in Mythic Plus, especially with the Legendary chest. So for that reason, Misery kind of lost some value here. So it's not very a clear-cut decision on when you should take it, although I will say this. Generally speaking, Mindbender is the go-to choice when you need boss damage. So if you're ever in a tyrannical situation, I would almost always pick Mindbender just because you will get the extra boss damage and you don't necessarily need Misery to help you compete with trash damage. Now that being said, for weeks like teaming, especially teaming fortified weeks, that's definitely a consideration to use Misery because there's so many more mobs out there and you just get dots out faster. But generally speaking, guys, I think you would be fine going with Bender most cases, and you don't also need to think of Bender as a boss only ability. You can absolutely use Mindbender on trash, especially long-lived trash packs as well. And even if it's only a 2 or 3 mob pack, you can still use Bender and extend your Void Form and get huge, 50 plus stack Void Forms, even higher depending on how many mobs are in the pack. So I don't know. I would say I would prefer Bender here, but again, it kind of depends on your group and what your group needs. So kind of take that into consideration. It's also kind of a playstyle thing. So if you're newer to Shadow Priest, I would suggest looking at the maybe Misery route for Fortified weeks and Bender route for Tyrannical weeks just to get kind of used to the mechanics. But I think if you're comfortable with it, I think if you can make Bender work, I think you'd see better results with it, generally speaking. All right. If you have any questions about that interaction, feel free to leave a comment down below. This is probably one of the harder choices that we have to make on the Shadow Priest talent spectrum. All right, and the last row we have is the level 100 talents. Again, kind of the same thing here. We're going to eliminate one of the options. Surrender of Madness is pretty much not used ever in Mythic Plus currently. The two options we do use decently often is going to be Legacy of the Void and Shadow Crash. Now, these two options kind of depend on the actual dungeon more so than the affixes, in my opinion. For the most part, Legacy of the Void and Shadow Crash offer fairly equal boss damage, assuming Shadow Crash always hits. The difference of it is, well, when you should take the either, I think, depends on the average mob pack size. So, for example, if you're in an instance like Maw of Souls, where you're only pulling like 2 or 3 mobs at a time, I don't know if you'd get as much benefit from Shadow Crash as you would for, say, you're doing Court of Stars and your group needs imp damage. Well, now you have Shadow Crash to use for imp damage. And I think those are the situations that you really want to look at. And that's just kind of a personal thing as well in your play style. I'd say this doesn't really come down to Fortified versus Tyrannical. It's, again, more about mob pack sizes. So another example would be if you're clearing Archway and you want more damage for blobs or rats or something like that, you could take Shadow Crash. However, a lot of the mobs in Archway are, generally speaking, smaller, like, again, 2 to 3 mob pack sizes. So you could go Legacy there. It just kind of depends on where you want your damage. And you can kind of make this choice with a lot of different dungeons. And it's kind of a playstyle thing too. But again, this is kind of a thing where with the recent changes to Shadow Crash where they buffed it a little bit, it's actually pretty decent in almost every scenario. And I don't think you'd ever be wrong to take it necessarily. And it doesn't really impact how many Void Forms you get since you can't enter Void Form earlier. So, yeah, I hope that kind of clears up when to take which one. Again, it's kind of more personal preference, but the main part of Shadow Crash is if you're going to take it, make sure you're using it on cooldown, yes, even if you're not in Void Form, and make sure that you are, it's going to hit the targets that you're using it on. So if the tank is doing crazy kiting pulls and you're not very confident that it will hit everything, maybe not take it. And again, really analyze the dungeon and the pack size, and more importantly, what does your group need? Does your group need more burst AoE? Maybe think about taking Shadow Crash and things like that. Especially burst AoE where you don't have a chance to get all of your dots on the targets, because then, you can still Shadow Crash in this case. So, and that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the talents. Again, went a little long here, very important. So if you have questions, leave them in the comments below. Alright guys, the next thing we're going to cover in this video is gearing your Shadow Priest for Mythic Plus dungeons. So there's kind of three big things I'll cover here: Legendaries, Trinkets, and then Tier. So with Legendaries, this is actually a pretty easy thing to talk about. There are pretty much 3 or 4 Legendaries that you'll want for Mythic Plus. The two big ones are going to be Seph's Secret. You'll pretty much use Seph's in every case all the time in Mythic Plus. Not only can you pretty much proc it on cooldown for all trash pretty much in the game, for most bosses as well, there's usually something to proc it on as well, either an add or an interrupt or a dispel. These are all very common things that we see in bosses. So you pretty much leave Seph's on all the time. The only question is, what is the second legendary that you'll use? For the most part, a good rule of thumb to follow is leave the legendary chest on for trash and then put the legendary belt on for bosses. This more applies especially for longer lived bosses. If a boss is only living like 30 to 60 seconds ish, you can probably just leave chest on. You wouldn't really notice the difference between going chest or belt in that instance. But any longer lived boss fight, you will notice the benefit of having your slightly extended void forms as you go on throughout the boss encounter. Now, as far as other things, there's a few things I'll mention as well. Some people also like playing with the Twins Painful Touch ring. However, I think with the recent Void Eruption changes and now we have Shadow Crash being so good, I don't actually think this thing has a whole lot of value, but that's more personal preference with your playstyle. I will not cover that in this video, but feel free to experiment if you'd like. Other okay tier legendaries will be Shoulders, Wrists, and even like Kil'jaeden's Burning Wish can be good if you don't have one of the other legendaries that I mentioned before. Now, you're probably wondering, well, wait, you said there's probably 4 that you want. You pretty much only listed 3. What's the 4th? The 4th one is Prydez. Prydez is absolutely amazing. It is a godsend. It's fantastic, specifically for pushing higher keys. Again, we'll get to this later on in the video, but Prydez is a great legendary to have, especially considering as a Shadow Priest, you don't have a whole lot of defensive utilities to use. Prydez is your kind of godsend in that regard. So there are many cases in like 19, 20 plus Mythic Plus keys where I will use Prydez on almost every boss fight, or even some trash pulls depending if it's fortified or tyrannical, just because that healing is so intense and it'll heal for millions over the course of just a simple boss fight. So definitely one you want to keep in mind. So it's a good idea to have kind of 3 gear sets as a Shadow Priest in a perfect world. Seph's chest set for trash, Seph's belt set for bosses, and then a Prydez Seph's set for when you need that extra defensive utility. Alright, that pretty much covers legendaries. Next step will be trinkets. I can't talk about trinkets too much because this is very dependent on what trinkets you own and how high eye level they are. I will say from Antorus, the Burning Throne raid, there are 2 really solid AoE trinkets to target. The first one being Prototype and the second one being Terminus. Prototype drops off of Garathi, the first boss, and Terminus drops off of High Command. So these are 2 trinkets you want to kind of target to get, but it's not critical that you get them. Things like Arcano Crystal, the Pantheon trinkets, or Acrid are also very solid trinket options as well. So those are kind of the pool of trinkets you want to kind of pick from. In addition, one thing I'll note about the Prototype trinket is be very, very careful with it. The 2 things you want to keep in mind with it are, when it procs on something, it will hit everything in a 20-yard radius. So if you're in like a close quarters environment, like some of the first packs on Darkheart Thicket or Court of Stars kind of first packs, there's a good chance your Prototype, if it procs, might pull things you're not in combat with. This is a similar situation we had with Thurible back in the day. So this is something you want to keep in mind with there. So it might be good to have an AoE set, if you're using Prototype, a set with Prototype and a set without it, just because it makes it easier for you to swap back and forth. Now that being said, if you don't want to swap gear sets necessarily, you still want the haste from it, whatever, you can always stand close to the mobs that you're attacking. That way Prototype won't proc. You need to be a certain distance away to actually proc the trinket. So something to keep in mind there. Another couple trinkets you can look at are Spectral Thurible, Fury of the Burning Sky and Grimoire. Those are 2 Nighthold trinkets. The only reason I'm bringing that up, if you have them, just because of the The Nether Shard vendor on Argus, if you get them like crazy high level, keep in mind those are actually decent to use as well. All right, the next thing that we'll cover here is your tier. Now, both tier 20 and tier 21 don't really have huge impacts for Shadow Priest damage in Mythic Plus. I will say I would lean towards tier 21 being the more impactful tier. However, again, it pretty much comes down to what do you have at highest eye level. There's nothing necessarily wrong with just equipping your highest eye level in Mythic Plus. Tier is not crucial for a lot of the ways that you will pull. But it's a good idea to pretty much, leave 4-piece tier 21 on and then equip highest eye level gear. That's generally speaking a good route to go through for Mythic Plus. There's not like a certain, oh, you need this amount of haste, you need this amount of crit. It's a lot more loosey-goosey for Mythic Plus. It's pretty much just get as many secondary stats as you possibly can. It's kind of the general rule of thumb that you can follow. Two of the things I'll kind of mention with gearing while we're here is collect gear that has avoidance and gear that has speed on it. These will be pretty useful for pushing keys, and I'll kind of, again, get to that later on in the video. All right, that pretty much does it for gearing. We'll move on here. All right, the next thing we're going to cover in this guide is your rotation, or I guess I should more say like a priority list of things to keep in mind while DPSing in a dungeon. There's not so much like do X, Y, and Z in this order all the time. It's a bit more loosey-goosey in that regards. First thing I'll say is, before you pull a pack, it's a good idea to precast something. Generally speaking, Mind Blast is a good one to do just to get you into Void Form as soon as possible. You can also do your dots or something else like that if you'd like. Now, the important thing to note is when to dot what. A good rule of thumb to follow is Shadow Word Pain on all targets that will live longer than a few seconds, probably like around 5 seconds, put Shadow Word Pain on all those targets. And then Vampiric Touch on the longer lived targets, like more 8 to 10 seconds length. And you'll kind of get a feel for doing this the more dungeons you do. So if that's kind of fuzzy for you, it's more or less just practicing. A good kind of rule of thumb is if you cast your dot and the target dies immediately, that's probably a wasted cast right there. On the very short-lived targets, that's when you're probably going to just Shadow Word Pain one target and then Mind Flay it and then just get the Mind Sear Cleave on everything. As kind of a good rule of thumb. Now, keep in mind, if you're using Misery, you're pretty much never going to cast just Shadow Word Pain unless you're moving. You're just going to Vampiric Touch all the things all the time, pretty much, and just get both dots on each target. Now, again, another very important thing is you can pretty much always cast Void Bolt on cooldown. The one exception being if you're pulling like a crazy amount and there's like 30 mobs in there, Mind Sear is, generally speaking, just keep Mind Flaying a target because there's so many mobs up. But usually speaking, cast your Void Bolt on cooldown just like you would in a raiding environment. The other thing I'll cover kind of early on here is Cepha's Secret. As we mentioned before, you're going to pretty much be using this all the time if you have it. So you want to try and proc Cepha's on cooldown every 30 seconds. If you don't have a weak order to track that, check out my weak order page in the description. Or I think Twin Top also has a good one as well. You can check out his. Or there's a bunch on Wago anyway you can look at to pick whatever you want. As long as you know when Cepha's is available to be procced, you should use it. Now, that being said, a few things to help you, how can I proc it? You can Mind Bomb every 30 seconds. Generally speaking, almost all trash mobs in Mythic Plus can be stunned. Some of them can't. Again, you'll kind of learn this with practice, but most can. You can also blanket silence mobs or interrupt mobs with your silence ability. Blanket silencing just means you cast silence on it, even if it's not casting. If it's a silenceable mob, it will proc Cepha's for you. You can also do things like Arcane Torrent for the same reason as Silence. You have Mass Dispel, which actually is pretty awesome utility in certain cases. So Court of Stars, I think, is the best example, in my opinion, for use cases for Mass Dispel. On the first boss, when he not roots everyone, he puts like a slow on everyone. People need to jump to get rid of the buff. You can just Mass Dispel everyone in the raid. You can proc your Cephas and help out your healer and the rest of your team. They don't have to jump, which is pretty nice. On Court of Stars, on the second boss, you can also, if a cast goes through, everyone gets this debuff, you can dispel that too. So keep in mind, Mass Dispel is awesome utility that you have here. There's also things like single dispelling an enemy depending on the buff that they have, so you can use different unit frames. Will show you when they have that active, so make sure you use that. And then you can also use things like Shackle Undead. It's a little bit more obscure, but for example, on the trash right before Skovald and Halls of Valor, they are like little minions that kind of walk towards the ad. Those guys can be Shackle Undead, proc your Cephas, and help out the team. Now, one thing I want to keep in mind with this, it's great that you have so many ways to proc Cephas, but sometimes it's worth it to actually hold off on a proc to help your team. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you're doing a very high key, or maybe even a kind of a mid-tier key, and it's a raging week, right? It's probably better to save your stun from when the mobs go raging rather than just to use it when it benefits you. And this is also very important because the more you stun a target, there's more diminishing returns on that stun. So what that means is, if say you stun and the tank stuns and then another DPS stuns all in a row, the full duration actually does not apply each time. It'll shrink the duration of those stuns until eventually it just won't even stun at all. So you want to make sure that you're not stacking stuns with other people. You want to time it correctly, that kind of thing. And the same goes for things like Silence and Arcane Torrent. Sometimes your group will need to hold off on those abilities to interrupt a specific mob. A good example is the Maw of Souls has a lot of very important interrupts. So that might be a case where you don't actually want to blanket silence things. You want to kind of wait and use that on something where you actually need to interrupt it. So kind of work with your group on if this is necessary on a pack by pack basis. And again, this is more impactful the higher keys you go up for your group. Now, another thing I'll cover here is Mindbender and Shadow Fiend. When should you use these? It's kind of again, depends on the key, depends on the affix, that kind of thing. You want to basically use Mindbender, relatively speaking, on cooldown if you can. It's such a low cooldown, you'll have it for the bosses when you really need it, but you can use it on trash. In fact, you should. It's not necessarily that you should use it the same time as you would in raids. Like, you don't have to wait until you hit your 30 stack mark. You can use it at maybe 20 stacks. You could even use it if it's a short-lived pack and you want to get into void form really fast. You could use Bender there. It's kind of use it when you need the insanity to perform something, right? But the important thing is, don't be afraid to use it on trash. It'll probably be it for bosses anyway. And then if you're not taking Bender, you're probably taking Misery, you'll have Shadow Fiend. Now, Shadow Fiend has a 3-minute cooldown, so it's a bit harder to plan out using it on trash, but usually if you're taking it, you can use it on maybe the first or second pack in the dungeon, and then you'll have it for bosses. But again, this is very dungeon dependent. The important thing is here, if you use it, you want to make sure it's going to be attacking something for the full duration. Or if you're using it, you want to make sure that you'll have it for the boss, because that's pretty much an uninterrupted time where it can hit your target. Now, the big part of Shadow Priest in Mythic Plus is going to be, dotting things up and knowing when to cast Void Eruption. Just because you're taking Legacy of the Void or Shadow Crash and you're ready to go into Void Eruption doesn't mean you should necessarily go into it as soon as possible. Usually with packs, you're going to make sure everything is dotted, at least with one dot, before going into Void form. This is just because Void Eruption is such a massive part of our damage, you want to make sure you're maximizing it. Now, that being said, don't sacrifice DPS on targets just to dot everything. What I mean by that is, let's say you could dot a few targets, get into Void form pretty fast, or dot everything. But if you waited to dot everything, if mobs are at like 20-30% health, that probably wasn't worth it, and you probably should have gone into Void form a bit sooner. So you kind of got to keep that in mind with the actual group. But when you're using the Legendary chest especially, you want to maximize your Void Eruption damage. So it's a good idea, especially if you're moving and kind of transitioning between packs, chain pulling, kind of just Shadow Word Pain everything and then Void Eruption if you can. After you've Shadow Word Pained everything, if you don't have enough Insanity, then maybe go through, cast Vampire Touch on a few things, or use Mind Flay and get your Mind Seer Insanity from that. Or even Shadow Crash to help you get Void Form faster. These are all kind of tools you need to use and learn to use in higher keys and things like that to put your damage in the right place at the right time. Now, one quick thing I'll say as well about the Mind Flay, Mind Blast relationship. For the most part, you're not going to be using Mind Blast that often on trash. You're pretty much just going to be using Mind Flay. Generally speaking, just because of the way Mind Seer scales with Insanity Generation versus Mind Blast. If you're fighting more than like 2-3 targets, you can pretty much eliminate Mind Blast from your rotation and just use Mind Flay. That's just because of, again, how Mind Seer works and how Insanity Generation goes. Now, the next thing we'll cover is Void Torrent. This kind of follows the same pattern. I would use it to extend your Void form or transition Void forms between packs. I wouldn't necessarily just use it on cooldown, especially if you still need to dot targets, or if there's a bunch out, you can use Mind Seer. Void Torrent has definitely kind of fallen off the priority list on bigger packs especially. So again, generally speaking, use it as the opener of the next pack or a situation where you want to extend your Void form. That's kind of the idea with that. Speaking of transitioning packs, another kind of rotation element that you can use is dispersion. If you don't need dispersion defensively, it's very important. You can use it as a transition element between two packs. Even if the pack is far enough away where you can't chain a Void form, using dispersion is still good to hold onto your Void form a bit longer. That way when you eventually hit the next pack, you have more time with lingering insanity. So use your dispersion as a gap filler, but make sure you don't use it and then not have it for, say, a boss when you really need it for a mechanic, right? That's very important. And the other thing I'll say is make sure you're using your prolonged powers, relatively speaking, on cooldown. Ideally, you want to use these when you're out of combat. That way it starts the cooldown ticking, because if you use it in combat, it will not go on cooldown until you pop out of combat. So kind of keep that in mind, but this is a free DPS cooldown almost every minute, depending on how you're pulling. Make sure you're using it to the maximum effectiveness as possible. All right. So I know that was, again, kind of quick, but there's a lot with the rotation with Shadow Priest. There's background footage you can look at, see what I'm doing, but it really just comes down to practice, get to know your Shadow Priest, and really get the feel of how to do the rotation as Shadow. And the more you play it, the better you'll get. All right. That's it for the rotation section. All right, guys, next section we're going to cover here is kind of specific tips for affixes. This is going to be pretty quick, but I wanted to cover a few things that are slightly important, a little subtle, but that's about it. The first affix I'll bring up is explosive. Explosive currently is something... Shadow Priest is not the best at killing explosive orbs, but they still need to die, right? So you need to do your part as a DPS in the group to help kill them. So some of the tools I really prefer to use when killing explosive, I think Void Bolt and Shadow or Death are my two favorite ones. However, Shadow or Death usually won't be available because it'll be at max health or die too fast for Shadow or Death. But I think Void Bolt, because it travels decently fast, especially if you're in melee range, Void Bolt is a great tool to help kill these fast. If that's not an option for you, you're not in Void from whatever, you can try Mind Blasting. However, sometimes it'll die before you finish the cast. Or even Mind Flaying. The thing to keep in mind is Mind Flay is just very slow, so it'll take a little bit longer. But kind of you want to think about using Void Bolt to kill explosives to help your group out. Again, this depends. If you're running with double melee and you're the only Shadow Priest, the only ranged in the group, the orbs should be dying pretty easily because melee, generally speaking, have an easier time of killing them. But again, work with your group, work with your comp about who needs to help out on orbs when. The other affix we'll cover is Grievous. Another kind of tool you can use in your toolkit to help your healers out with Grievous is be aware of Vampiric Embrace. It is a healing cooldown. Doesn't do a whole lot, but it can help with Grievous specifically. Now, with a Grievous bursting combo, something else to think about is using Fighter Chow Food. Again, work with your healer to see if this is something that will benefit the group at the loss of some very minor bit of DPS. Just know that you have that in your toolkit to use. The next affix we'll cover is Quaking, which is the one that, you know, when like randomly throughout the dungeon, you'll get like a circle around you, and if that circle finishes its little kind of filling out thing, it will interrupt you if you're casting something and silence you for a few seconds. So something to keep in mind there is you have Void Bolt. It's probably the easiest way to get out of Quaking is just stutter step a bit, Void Bolt as its cast goes out, and then you don't get interrupted or silenced. You can also use Shadowed Pain if Void Bolt is off cooldown, or on cooldown rather. And next affix we'll cover is Skittish. Don't have a whole lot to say here. Usually it's not a problem for range, but if you're ever having issue with aggro on Skittish weeks, keep in mind you have Fade, which does reduce the amount of threat that is currently out for you. So you can use that kind of as a reaction to you getting aggro with something. And I highly recommend check out Wowhead has a page on affixes. It's linked in the description below to kind of go over all the different affixes and combinations. You want to be very familiar with these before you go into a key, especially if you're newer with the Mythic Plus system. All right, pretty much all I have to say about specific affixes. If you have more tips or you want to throw out with people, throw them in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys do on specific affixes. All right. All right, so the last two tidbits of information we're going to go over in this video is about pushing high keys and how you survive. So the first one, with pushing high keys, the most important thing here is just understanding the timing and positioning of a bunch of pulls, right? If you're not very familiar with what your tank is doing or how it's doing, you're going to be at a very hard disadvantage. You want to make sure you're coordinating with the tank. What are you pulling? How much are you pulling? Things like that. And generally speaking, once you do it a few times, it's pretty similar. A lot of tanks and groups kind of adopt the same strategy for key pulls. So you can kind of get the swing of things very, not quickly necessarily, but the more you do a dungeon, the more familiar you'll get with these kind of things. And this is especially important for things like Shadow Crash or saving cooldowns or things like that, because if you Shadow Crash at the wrong time and you only get 2 mobs and the tank was still pulling, then you just missed out on a bunch of damage there. So definitely something you want to kind of improve on and help out your overall DPS in that sense. And this is also a good point to bring up. The use of your actual on-use trinkets is also very crucial here too, right? So if you're not coordinated with the tank and you use your on-use trinket and then the tank moves all the mobs away, well, then you just lost, the group lost damage, right? So you want to make sure you're coordinating with the tank of, hey, when are you stopping pulling? Or, hey, I just used my trinket, can we not move for a second, right? These are very good communication tips you should be using, and this is why getting into voice with your tank, whether or not you're pugging or not, is a great idea, just because otherwise your coordination is just going to be all over the place, right? And the same thing goes with actual chain pulling. You want to know if you're chaining packs together, you want to know if you're stopping, all this kind of stuff to help you time out your dispersion uses between packs and things like that. Now, another thing I'll say is as a ranged player, it's kind of, you'll feel the need to play back a bit. Generally speaking, that's not a great idea in Mythic Plus. You want to kind of stay near the melee, that way it's easier for you to move and transition between packs. If you're constantly playing too far back, you'll just be lagging behind when they're pulling. So you kind of want to stay near the melee group, but don't be like hugging them necessarily, depending on the Affix week. But it's definitely something you don't want to get left behind with your group, okay? And the kind of last little tidbit I'll say with pushing high keys, if you're finding yourself that you're not getting invited to groups or people are saying something about Raider.io, Raider.io is a website that basically tracks the dungeons you have done and the ones you've completed. It's kind of an arbitrary score system, but fortunately, a lot of groups are using this to help you determine if you are good enough or experienced enough to be invited to the group. So if you're finding yourself constantly being denied for groups for whatever reason, pay attention to your Raider.io score. It's very important that you at least get a 15 done on every dungeon level before going above that. Or let's say you want to push to 15s, right? Make sure you have a plus 10 done on every dungeon, every key, right? These are small improvements you can help make your score a little bit better. And I'll link the website down below if you want to check out your character to see where you're at. This is a very big part of dungeons right now as far as the social interaction goes. So make sure you keep an eye on your score. And if you want to get invited to more pugs, get your score up. Whether or not let's say you have a plus 15 done, maybe you look for a plus 16 or plus 17 in that dungeon to try and get a little bit higher of a score. Or let's say you've never done Seat of the Triumvirate, the new dungeon on Argus, which I'm sure many of you have probably not done. Maybe you get that dungeon done just to get a bit more out of your score, right? These are things you kind of want to pay attention to when you're starting to get into that pug world for Shadow Priest, all right? Now, the last part of kind of pushing high keys that I want to cover is different little tips for survival and how to maximize your character in a dungeon. So this more applies for tyrannical instances where the boss's abilities are just hitting incredibly hard. You have a lot of tools in your toolkit to help kind of like reduce that damage. Now, granted, you might not have as much as other classes or other specs, you'll soon find out, but you do have some things that you can use. So I mentioned a few of these things earlier in the video. So Prides is probably the best part here. If you're on a tyrannical boss, especially on a higher key for your gear, your level, you should probably be using Prides, right? Just take off the chest or the belt or whatever and use Prides Ceph. It's usually a good route to go here. Another thing to do to help mitigate damage is using avoidance gear and high stamina gear. So this is crucial. Even if you're dropping a set bonus, living is much more important, right? Like if you're not alive, you're not doing DPS, especially if your group doesn't have a battle res available. So it's okay to sacrifice some DPS to put on a piece with avoidance on it or a piece with a significant amount of more stamina on it. And again, leave Prides on. Prides is great. And the other thing you think about too is even using a stamina flask. I've done this in, especially like I was doing a 21 Dark Heart before, and I basically needed the stamina flask to help live through the last boss's abilities. So it's a good idea to keep a stamina flask or two on you. It's like 2,000 stamina, I think. Nothing crazy, but again, every little bit can help. I also mentioned before you can use Masochism. This is another talent you can use. So if you know a certain boss ability is about to come out, Shadow Mend yourself, get that 10% DR real quick. Again, I wouldn't necessarily start taking Masochism until you know that you need it, or else you won't live, or it will help significantly if you did take it. You can also use Dispersion. Keep in mind you're not going to get a whole lot of uses out of it, so you want to save it for the biggest hitting ability that you would get targeted with. And you can also pre-cast Power Word Shield. So for instance, on Dark Heart Thicket, if Nightmare Bolt is coming at you, probably a good idea to pre-cast Power Word Shield. It's only like a small shield amount, like maybe 500k, but again, every little bit can help here. And then guys, the other thing I'll mention, in addition, another set, like piece of gear that you can create, a set gear, it is a speed set. It seems kind of silly, but as you're transitioning between packs, it can be actually pretty useful, especially in things like Vault of the Wardens when you're transitioning between some of the bosses. Put on a speed set. Helps you get to the boss faster. Your group can pull faster. They don't have to wait for you. These are all good things. The big parts of speed sets is using Cephas, which you'll have on anyway if you have it. But you can also keep, speed gear with you. Even if it's like stupid low eye level, you can make a speed set to help you transition faster. It's just something good to have. Although with taking Body and Soul and having Cephas on, this usually is not a huge problem for you, but something you can use to help min-max your speed just a bit that much more. Alright guys, and that concludes this video. I hope you've learned something about how to play your Shadow Priest in Mythic Plus. If you have any questions, like I said, leave them in the comments below, or I can answer anything that I can possibly do. I will. And look out for more videos coming soon. I want, hopefully at some point I'll get alpha access or beta or whatever it is at the time. I plan on making more videos about that if that ever happens, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thanks for watching guys, and have a great day.